The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between August 1942 and February 1943, is often cited as the most significant turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front. It was a cataclysmic clash between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, a ferocious struggle for control of a city bearing Stalin's name. Many know the broad strokes of the battle: the encirclement of the German Sixth Army, the brutal street fighting, and the Soviet counteroffensive that led to a crushing Axis defeat. But what's often overlooked is just how horrific the Battle of Stalingrad truly was, not just in its scale, but in the suffering it inflicted on soldiers and also civilians. The reality of Stalingrad wasn't just military defeat or strategic victory. The reality of Stalingrad wasn't just military defeat or strategic victory, it was a descent into hell. To support our channel, please click subscribe. At Stalingrad, the human cost was unprecedented. Estimates suggest that between 2 and 2.5 million people, soldiers and civilians, were killed, wounded or captured during the battle. The German Sixth Army lost, alone, around 300,000 men, either killed, wounded or taken prisoner. Most of the 91,000 who surrendered in February 1943 would die in Soviet captivity. But the Soviet side suffered even more. Official Soviet figures speak of over 1.1 million military casualties, a staggering number that does not include the civilian dead. Tens of thousands of civilians were trapped in the city as it was bombarded into rubble, their bodies never being recovered, their stories lost in the smoke and the snow. The true horror is not just the scale of death, but the slow, grinding way it came. Frostbite, disease, starvation, dehydration, exhaustion and constant terror made Stalingrad an open-air slaughterhouse. Men froze to death in their trenches. Wounded soldiers lay groaning in cellars for days before succumbing to gangrene or blood loss. In the end, the battlefield was littered with frozen corpses, so many that they were often used as cover or stacked to block the wind. Before the battle even began in earnest, the Luftwaffe launched a devastating aerial bombardment of the city in August 1942. In just a few days, German bombers reduced large swathes of Stalingrad to rubble. Thousands of civilians were killed in these opening strikes alone. Fires raged for days, turning streets into impassable infernos. Survivors described black snow, ash falling from the sky for weeks afterwards. And yet many civilians remained. Soviet authorities forbade mass evacuation, insisting that the population stay and help with their war effort. Women dug trenches, teenagers manned anti-aircraft guns, and factory workers continued to produce weapons mere blocks from the front lines. They lived underground, in basements and sewers, often with no food or clean water. Starvation became routine. Some resorted to eating leather, rats, or even glue. By the time the battle ended, Stalingrad's population had plummeted from 600,000 to barely 1,500. The cruelty was not accidental. Both sides treated the city as a symbol. The Germans wanted to humiliate Stalin, while the Soviets believed Stalingrad must be held at any cost. Civilians were caught directly in the middle. They were used as human shields, accused of sabotage or simply abandoned. Stalingrad gave rise to a new kind of warfare, Rattenkrieg, or Rat War, as the Germans called it. It was a brutal form of close combat fighting, with fighting taking place room by room, floor by floor, even sewer by sewer. The front line often ran through individual buildings. Soldiers would die to seize a staircase, only to be pushed out the next hour. At times, Soviet and German troops occupied different floors of the same apartment block, unable to move or sleep for days on end due to the constant grenade attacks and gunfire. Snipers also became legendary in Stalingrad. The most famous was Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev, who claimed 225 kills and became a propaganda hero. But the truth was more horrific. Snipers turned Stalingrad into a paranoid nightmare. Stepping into a ruined street often meant instant death. Snipers targeted medics, messengers, even stretcher bearers. German officer Wilhelm Hoffmann described the city as a giant crematorium where only death was certain. The filth in Stalingrad was also overwhelming. Corpses were piled up, unburied and rotting. Rats swarmed the trenches and cellars, feasting on the dead. Lice spread typhus. Soldiers wore the same clothes for months. It wasn't uncommon for men to suffer hallucinations, madness, or emotional collapse. For many, Stalingrad wasn't just a battle, it was the edge of their sanity. By late 1942, the Germans were encircled. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counter-offensive, had slammed into the weakly held Romanian and Italian flanks, trapping over 250,000 Axis troops in the Stalingrad pocket. Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to hold fast. Surrender is forbidden, he told General Paulus. A disastrous airlift plan followed, where Goering promised the Luftwaffe that the Luftwaffe could supply the army from the air, and that failed catastrophically. As the winter deepened, conditions became apocalyptic. German soldiers had no winter clothing, no food and no medicine. They burned furniture for heat. They shot their own horses. They ate bread made from sawdust. Frostbite turned fingers black. Amputations were done with no anaesthetic. Men wept from hunger. Some even resorted to cannibalism, a fact which was later suppressed by both German and Soviet authorities. General Paulus himself became a symbol of the disaster. Promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler, a not-so-subtle order to take his own life rather than surrender, Paulus instead laid down his arms on the 31st of January 1943, and in that action he became the first German Field Marshal in history to be captured alive. For the Soviets, Stalingrad was a moment of epic resistance, but one that came at an unbearable cost. Soviet generals threw men into battle with minimal training and equipment. Penal or punishment battalions were used as shock troops, forced to charge machine gun nests with little more than rifles or grenades. Not a step back, ordered Stalin, and behind the front lines, NKVD, Secret Service units, enforced that decree with bullets. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were shot by their own side for desertion or cowardice. Zhukov and other commanders adopted a strategy of attrition, bleeding the Germans dry with wave after wave of infantry. It worked, but it also meant entire Soviet divisions were wiped out. Some battalions lasted only days before being destroyed. One Soviet lieutenant recalled, "We were told, you are not expected to survive. You are expected to stop the Germans." Even the wounded were expendable. Medics had little time or resources. Soldiers bled to death in trenches or froze solid where they lay. Others were trampled during counterattacks or buried under rubble as buildings collapsed. Stalingrad was not just a victory, it was a mass grave brought with Soviet blood. When the battle ended in February 1943, Stalingrad was unrecognisable. The city was a charred skeleton. Over 90% of it had been destroyed. The Volga River ran thick with ash and frozen corpses. Survivors wandered through the ruins, dazed, frostbitten, starving. The air stank of death for months. The captured Germans were marched into captivity. Most would never return. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only 5,000 survived the gulags and death marches. Many froze on the way to prison camps. Others starved behind barbed wire. For the Soviets, they were the symbols of fascist defeat. For the Germans, they were ghosts, erased from the official story for years. Stalingrad's victory came at a terrible price. The Red Army had bled itself nearly dry. Millions would continue to die in the long march to Berlin, but from Stalingrad onwards, Hitler's dreams of conquest began to die. The Wehrmacht would never again regain the initiative in the east. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military engagement, it was a slow-motion apocalypse, a human catastrophe that defies full comprehension. It wasn't simply the bloodiest battle of World War II, it was amongst the most brutal events in human history. It was worse than we think, because it wasn't just soldiers fighting for strategic objectives. It was millions of lives torn apart, entire families buried under the snow and rubble, a city sacrificed to a war machine. Stalingrad was where humanity bled dry in the snows of southern Russia, and where the world changed forever. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please click subscribe down below, and once again, thanks for watching.